Good morning and welcome to another installment of our Wellness Wednesday. I'm Dr. Rachel Stricker. I'm a naturopathic physician in Eugene, Oregon, and this is my channel, Illuminate with Dr. Rachel, so answering all your health and wellness questions. So this is part of our Masterful May, and this is our third week of doing our Wellness Wednesday, and today we're going to talk about hormones. So this is kind of another big topic that I've chosen. So what I want to achieve today is just sharing with you a little bit about some of the most important hormones and how they may affect your health and how they may affect your everyday life. I think it's really important to understand the physical body really well. And it's such a complex system. And that's why, we physicians spend so much time studying all the facets of the human body. But I want to try to break things down so that you can get to know your physical body a little bit better. And today we're going to be talking about hormones. So this is a area of medicine or an area of health called endocrinology, which is really the study of glands and hormones. So hormones are produced by the glands, and we'll talk about several of the important glands today, but certainly won't cover all of the glands and all of the hormones. And then the hormones are chemical messengers, and so they're acting throughout the body as chemical messengers from the glands to other places in the body. And so what we have throughout the body are these receptor sites to receive these chemical messengers. So throughout the body, there are different receptor sites, and some receptor sites are more concentrated in certain areas, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they really are doing a ton of regulation of things that are happening in the body. And there's all of these really interesting feedback loops throughout the glands too. And we're going to talk about some of those really important feedback loops as a whole too. So again, if you're tuning into the live show today, feel free to ask questions along the way. If you watch the playback of this video, you're also welcome to ask questions. Just post them in the comments. If you enjoy this video, please don't forget to subscribe so that the channel can grow and we can share more of this health and wellness information. So certainly the hormones that we're going to talk a lot about today are going to be what is sometimes referred to as the sex hormones. So the estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, I will talk about those, especially in reference to women's health, so to the menstrual cycle, as well as the perimenopausal and menopausal phases that women go throughout their life cycle. And we'll talk about men's health and men's hormones and the development of those hormones and the importance in men, as well as andropause, which is oftentimes when those hormones are also dropping off for men, in particular testosterone. So we'll discuss that a little today. We're going to talk about the adrenals and the adrenal hormones, and then certainly talk about thyroid hormone as well. So that's where our kind of focus energy is going to be. But again, there's many other glands and many other hormones that are also important, but this is what we'll focus and touch on today. Okay, so I think the most important place to start is talking about what we call the HPA axis. So these are 3 different glands that are connected and are really important for the regulation of many different hormones. So the H stands for hypothalamus, the P stands for pituitary, and the A stands for adrenals. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary is actually up in the brain, and then our adrenals are, we have 2 adrenal glands, and they sit right on top of kidneys. So those are down more in the thorax, in this part of the body, so just below or just above the kidney, excuse me. So this HPA axis has a negative feedback loop. These glands are constantly talking to each other. They're really doing a lot of regulation for for all of the hormones in the body. So the hypothalamus produces several different hormones that then are stored in the pituitary. I'm not going to focus a lot on the hypothalamus, but just know that it's kind of right at the top of that axis and that feedback loop, and is really important producing some of the hormones again that are stored in the pituitary, and the pituitary is what is triggering production in the adrenals or sending them directly out into the bloodstream. The pituitary does that as well. The hypothalamus often comes into play. We talk about it a lot as being the thermoregulator in the body. So this is like regulating body temperature, but this is far beyond just the regulation of when we have fevers and resetting the body temperature and things like that. This is a gland that's constantly working to maintain our homeostasis, maintain where we want to be on an everyday basis. So the pituitary is really known as a master gland, and the pituitary produces so many different things. So we think about the pituitary as producing growth hormone. Growth hormone certainly is very active in children as they're growing, but then continues to also be involved in our metabolism even as adults. The pituitary gland also produces luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. These two hormones are really important in our sex hormone production, and I'm going to touch on those in just another moment as we talk a little bit more about women's health, and they also have an effect, of course, for men too. The pituitary also produces prolactin. Prolactin, most importantly, is for milk production for lactation in nursing mothers. And then the pituitary also produces thyroid stimulating hormone. So we're going to kind of take into a side note and talk about the thyroid specifically now. So thyroid stimulating hormone is produced by the pituitary, and it is what then is triggering the thyroid to produce its T3 and T4. And so for someone who has an issue with their thyroid, when those thyroid levels are being checked, oftentimes TSH will only be looked at, but a really good thorough look at thyroid hormones and at the production of these hormones and how the thyroid is doing when you're looking at, whether medications are working or if you need to change up dosages or things like that. Looking at it more thoroughly would be to look at the TSH, the T3, the T4. The thyroid antibodies are really important. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And even sometimes looking at something that's called the reverse T3. So there can be some confusion with hypo and hyperthyroid, and it's a little confusing because of the TSH. So when the TSH is high, is above those lab values that we want to see, this is actually hypo or underactive thyroid. So the reason for this is that thyroid stimulating hormone would be high because it's telling the thyroid, hey, you need to work harder, you need to produce more of this T3 and T4. The pituitary gland isn't seeing enough of the T3, T4 in circulation, and so it's producing more TSH to tell the thyroid to work harder, work harder. So, and then when we have hyperthyroid or overactive thyroid, there's a very low level of TSH because that TSH, that thyroid stimulating hormone, doesn't need to be produced because there's already too much T3, T4 in circulation. So hopefully that helps clarify things that oftentimes confuses people on the hyper and hypothyroid. So hypothyroid, underactive thyroid, is a much more common disorder that I see than the hyperthyroid, although this certainly happens as well. And then we kind of had two different forms of the hyper and hypothyroid because there can be an autoimmune cause to this thyroid dysfunction. And so in hypothyroidism, we think about this autoimmune component being Hashimoto's. That's the name of it, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And in hyperthyroid, there's also a name for it, and it's called Graves' disease. So those are an autoimmune reaction, which means that that basically the immune system is attacking the thyroid and causing it to have this dysfunction. So autoimmune is a whole another topic. We don't know for sure, what causes this, but we suspect that that it's something that causes the immune system to basically go haywire. And oftentimes, this can be triggered by a virus or a toxic load. So there can be a lot of tie-ins with that and autoimmune thyroid issues. So why is hypothyroidism so common? Why is it so common, especially in women? So I think that the answer to that really does come down to the fact that, all of these glands, again, are so closely related. There's so much regulation here between the female sex hormones. There's so much regulation here or so much connection here between our diet and our lifestyle, the amount of stress that we have in our life, the amount of sleep that we get, the foods that we're consuming, all of this really comes into play. There also is an issue oftentimes with iodine in that underactive thyroid disorder. So sometimes this can come from having too low levels of iodine, and iodine deficiency is actually a very common deficiency. So sometimes that can come into play. There also seems to be this very close connection with the thyroid and soy consumption. And that also has to do with the iodine and the iodine uptake. So a lot of those things are really closely related too. So in hypothyroidism, we'll see things like a lot of fatigue, maybe weight gain, or just trouble losing weight. There can be a lot of dry skin, hair loss, constipation. Those are some of the main hypothyroid symptoms. There also can be a lot of fatigue and brain fog and things like that go along with it. In hyperthyroidism, we kind of see the opposite of those symptoms. So there might be a lot of excess energy, anxious energy. There might be heart palpitations. There might be diarrhea. There might be difficulty sleeping. There might be sensations of feeling very hot, where in hypothyroidism, there's a lot of sensations of always being cold. So those are all of those close connections, again, between the glands, between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and then the production of those thyroid hormones and how the thyroid reacts. Next, we're going to drop down. So we're still talking about our HPA axis. So we've got our hypothalamus, our pituitary, and now we're going to talk about the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland, there's two different parts of it. So there's the cortex, which is kind of the outer layer, and then there's the medulla, which is the inside. Now, there are basically three kinds of hormones that the adrenal cortex produces. One way we always remembered this in medical school, I'm sure it was one of my teachers that taught us this, but we talk about that it gets sweeter as you go in. So it's salt, sugar, sex. So that's the adrenal cortex as you're moving towards the medulla. So what this means is that on that outside of the cortex, we have what's known as mineral corticoids. So this is basically has to do with our salt and water content, which also is very connected to our blood pressure. So blood pressure isn't just about what's happening in the cardiovascular system, in the heart and the blood vessels itself, but actually has very much to do also with what's happening in the kidneys, and then certainly this production that's happening in the adrenal cortex with our salt and water regulation. So that's a really important thing to understand as well. Then we have our glucocorticoids. So the main one that we think about with the glucocorticoids is cortisol. So cortisol, we hear a lot about cortisol being the stress hormone and all of these things, and it is. And cortisol kind of gets a bad rap, oh, you have too much cortisol because you have too much stress and it's making you gain weight. And all of those things are true. But cortisol also is really closely involved in our sugar metabolism, in our glucose metabolism, and so certainly certainly that plays into things like diabetes and even metabolic syndrome, which is kind of the newer term for pre-diabetes. And this does have to also do with where we store fat. But cortisol also is something that we're supposed to produce as part of this normal circadian rhythm. And so what's supposed to happen is that we produce a lot of cortisol. Our highest level of cortisol should be when we first wake up in the morning. It's actually what allows us to feel awake and aroused and get moving in the morning. And then we start to, as we're up and moving, we start to drop that cortisol. We get oftentimes a little spike of cortisol right after lunchtime, so in the early afternoon. And then from there, that slowly starts to drop throughout the evening until the other side of the circadian rhythm is when the pineal gland is producing melatonin to help us regulate our sleep cycle. So that's the way it's supposed to look. But oftentimes, what I see in my practice is a blunting of the cortisol. So you might just have these really low levels of cortisol all day. You never really get any spikes. You don't have that spike in the morning. That's when people are feeling really tired. They're feeling groggy. They can't really get up and get moving in the morning. So it's just kind of low levels all day. I also will see some reverse cortisol spikes. So sometimes it's like, oh, the cortisol is just really low in the morning. It's really low all day. And then all of a sudden they get this spike like later in the evening, and they have energy for the first time all day, and they can't really go to sleep. They're not really ready to go to sleep. They get this like second wind at like 9, 10 p.m. And then have trouble going to sleep. There also can be spikes of the cortisol in the middle of the night, and this can also be contributing to people who are having sleep issues. So they may be getting these cortisol spikes in the middle of the night, where they're waking up in the middle of the night and they're actually feeling super awake and aroused and can't get back to sleep. So having a proper regulation of cortisol, where again we're having the highest amount first thing in the morning, getting a little bit of drop, a secondary little spike in the afternoon, and then that slowly starts to drop down for the rest of the evening. And that's the way it's supposed to look. But oftentimes I also see people who have this really big drop of energy in the afternoon. That can also have to do with diet and what people are consuming for lunch. Certainly, if they have a really carbohydrate heavy, really sugar heavy lunch, they're gonna oftentimes have that drop. But it also can have to do with the cortisol regulation. So cortisol overall is actually we're supposed to get these spikes of cortisol when there's stressors, again, to make us feel strong and alert and awake. It's part of that fight or flight concept, as well as our catecholamines, which is what is being produced in the adrenal medulla. I'll touch on that in just a moment as we work our way in. But the cortisol, what happens is that so many people are under chronic levels of stress. And what we find that's really interesting about cortisol is that cortisol is actually very anti-inflammatory in nature when it's produced the way that it's meant to be produced. Is that we have these kind of acute stressors, and then those stressors go away, and so we have this anti-inflammatory effect of the cortisol. But what actually happens, interestingly, in chronic stress is that cortisol actually becomes very inflammatory when it's sticking around in the system for too long. So that's why cortisol kind of gets this bad rap as being very inflammatory or causing a lot of like weight gain and being part is that it's just because of this chronic stress that is really a big problem, especially in our Western culture. Next, in the adrenal cortex, we have the androgens. So the androgens are our sex hormones, and so one of the main ones that's produced in the adrenals is called DHEA. And DHEA has a little bit more affinity towards testosterone, but can also be converted into estrogen and progesterone as well, those other hormones, but does have a slight affinity towards being produced in testosterone. Now, DHEA actually peaks around the age of 25, and then we see this slow decline as people age. So I will oftentimes, especially in my older patients, my postmenopausal women, or my older male patients, I'll see really low levels of DHEA. And oftentimes supplementing with some DHEA really helped people feel tremendously better. So it actually, we will take it in the morning, because it's oftentimes very energizing, but people get this really great sense of vitality by getting those DHEA levels up. So sense of vitality, definitely improved libido and sexual function in general, but just more energy, more vitality, feeling really good from the DHEA. So DHEA is really important in that regard. You have to be a little careful with it. When I'm dosing with patients, I often start really low on the DHEA and kind of test and look at the levels, and then we'll work our way up over time, because it's tricky because we don't really know where DHEA is going to convert to. So we assume that a lot of it will convert towards testosterone, but again, sometimes it can convert towards estrogen. And if I'm giving it to a male, I don't want a lot of that DHEA being converted into estrogen. And the same goes with some females. So in postmenopausal women, we oftentimes want to get those testosterone levels up, but not to the extent that they're maybe having side effects. One of the main side effects that women really don't like is when they start to grow facial hair because of that testosterone. I talked about having different receptor sites. One of the main testosterone receptor sites are those male hair patterns. So we see, the hair growth on the face, on the chin, and on the cheeks, and even sometimes on the chest as well. And so, that's a surefire way for the female patients to be very unhappy about their hormone regulation when there's too much testosterone. So just, something to keep in mind with DHEA and DHEA dosing. You have to be very careful with it. You don't want to start at those really high doses unless you're really keeping an eye on it closely. I'm going to talk more about the sex hormones in just a moment, but let's go ahead and finish up with the adrenals, as we're talking about that HPA axis. So that gets us through our cortex of the adrenal, and now we're going to go to the medulla, which is the inner part of the adrenals. And this is where the catecholamines come into play. So this is epinephrine, norepinephrine, also kind of known as adrenaline. And this is, again, our fight or flight response, our fight, flight, or freeze response. And this has to do with stress. Again, this is one of the ways that the adrenal glands get fatigued or burnt out, is with these chronic levels of stress that are going to deplete those catecholamines, and that are certainly going to cause a dysregulation of the cortisol cycles as well. And especially with the depletion of the catecholamines, one thing that happens as well is with chronic or excessive amounts of caffeine intake. So the adrenals are also producing that, and what caffeine is actually causing us to do is causing the adrenals to release those catecholamines to actually give us those energy levels. But having chronic intake of caffeine, too much caffeine, is going to deplete those catecholamines and burn out the adrenals, and that's where that comes into play as well. Okay, so that is our HPA axis. We've got our hypothalamus, a big regulator in the body. We've got our pituitary, the master gland, really involved with the thyroid gland as well. And then our adrenals, which are taking care of our salt and water regulation, are taking care of our sugar and cortisol regulation, are taking care of our sex hormone regulation, and then also taking care of those catecholamines, that fight or flight response. So the adrenal glands are also very, very important. Okay, so let's transition into talking about those androgens and those sex hormones, because that is a big topic in and of itself. So we talked about the pituitary gland being the one that produces the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. So let me talk first about the way the menstrual cycle works. So we will talk about the menses as being a 28-day cycle. So that's kind of the average number, but certainly it can be shorter than that. It can be longer than that. It's still normal for it to be a few days shorter of that 28 days or a few days longer than that 28 days. But we are seeing something that would be irregular or abnormal would be, really anything that's, a menstrual cycle that's shorter than, maybe 26 days, maybe 24 days, somewhere there, and then a menstrual cycle that is lasting more than like 30 to 32 days. Those would be, more irregular patterns that we would see. So the first part of the menstrual cycle that we talk about, so we talk about day one is the first day of bleeding, and then however long you're bleeding is kind of that menstrual cycle. So on average, that's about, on average it's between 3 and 7 days. We'll call 5 days as our regular or our median number. And then we're going to go into the follicular stage. So the follicular stage is basically day 6 to 14. And so this is when that FSH, which again is produced by the pituitary gland, is really taking off. And so this is stimulating the growth of the follicle to prepare the egg for release for ovulation. We think about ovulation is taking place somewhere around day 14. And so that's when the egg is actually being released from the follicle. So follicle stimulating hormone is increasing. Those estrogen levels are starting to rise. And then we release that egg, the follicle stimulating hormone starts to drop off. And then the estrogen also kind of starts to drop off a little bit. So estrogen and progesterone levels are really low during when a woman is bleeding during the actual menses. And then we start to see a rise of the estrogen. And then progesterone is much more active during the luteal phase, during the second half of that menstrual cycle. So follicle stimulating hormone is also important for spermogenesis, so of the making of sperm in the male as well. So we have our ovulation, and then we have our luteal phase. So that luteal hormone, luteal stimulating hormone, is starting to come into play. So in men, this also is a regulator of our progesterone and our testosterone, highly active in the testes and ovaries, but again, is coming from the pituitary, and this is what's really stimulating that ovulation, that release of the egg. And then, as I said, progesterone is really important in the second half of the cycle. And so a lot of the issues that we see in women who are having a menstrual cycle, so whether it be PMS, whether it be really intense cramping during their menstrual cycle, whether it be really irregular cycles, so infrequent cycles, or their cycles are all over the place. They have a 24-day cycle, and then they have a 36-day cycle, and they just go back and forth. All of that really has to do with the levels of progesterone. And on average, people are really deficient in progesterone, both males and females. This is a really normal thing that I see in my practice, is a lot of low levels of progesterone in both men and women. And progesterone is really important in the body, certainly really important in the menstrual cycle and the regulation of the menstrual cycle. So whether I'm using bioidentical hormones and we are supporting the menstrual cycle with some progesterone, and I'm dosing that progesterone on the backside of the menstrual cycle. So we don't give it all month long. Typically, every once in a while, I'll give it all month long for different reasons, but usually just on the second half of the cycle. And that's what I do, even if we're doing more herbal support to help regulate the menstrual cycle and help regulate progesterone, is that we're just giving it the second half of the cycle. So usually about day 16 to 26 is when I'm doing the dosing of progesterone or the herbal helpers for helping with progesterone. So that would be where those are coming into play. And progesterone is basically it's helping. So it's being produced too by the corpus luteum as part of the uterus lining. So basically, this is just prepping the female body for receiving the egg and receiving fertilization of that egg every single month. And so we create this lining, readying the uterus for a baby. And then when a baby isn't there, that's when that lining is shed and the menstrual cycle begins all over again. So we're creating that fresh lining. And the progesterone is really important, especially in early pregnancy, for maintaining the lining there of the uterus. So just a good thing to keep in mind too. So I think that's all I'll say right now about the menstrual cycle, and we'll kind of transition into talking about perimenopause and menopause as well as andropause. Now, I mentioned that low progesterone levels are really common, especially in people who are having issues with the regulation of the menstrual cycle. Sometimes this can be coming from an estrogen dominance. So estrogen and progesterone really have this balance and this dance between each other. And so, when there's too much estrogen, you're going to have low progesterone levels. And estrogen dominance is a really common thing too. Estrogen dominance happens in both men and women. I see this really often in men, especially as they're going through andropause and those testosterone levels are dropping down. And sometimes it's because of estrogen dominance. And there's a couple of habits that also create more estrogen dominance, especially in men. And it's because of two herbs that are commonly used, and that's cannabis and hops. So I find a lot of estrogen dominance in men who consume either smoking or even taking a lot of edibles of cannabis, and also in men who drink a lot of beer because of the hops that's in beer. And so both of those things can lead to estrogen dominance and cause those testosterone levels to decrease too. So estrogen kind of like is something that can just, basically mute out progesterone and mute out the testosterone when there's too much. And then we start to see, when there's an estrogen dominance, we also will start to see more fat being put on the body in places where estrogen receptors are high. So estrogen receptors are really high in the breasts, in the upper arms, and in the belly. And so these are places where we see those female fat patterns because of the estrogen, and that can happen in men too. And so someone who has what we talk about as the beer belly can be from having those higher levels of estrogen. And then creating those higher that more adipose tissue, more fat tissue in the abdomen. So that's a really typical pattern that I will see too, because hops and cannabis are those very, very feminizing herbs. And there's a lot of phytoestrogens that are around. So phytoestrogens, I worry much less about than xenoestrogens, which tend to cause more of a problem in the body. So phytoestrogens, we think about phytoestrogens as being something like soy is a phytoestrogen. So soy can change the amount of estrogens that we have in the body as well. Soy, I talked about even in my Thursday table yesterday, soy kind of gets a bad rap. In general, soy is actually quite good for you and very protective for the body and protective against certain kinds of cancers. But there can be an issue when soy is GMO soy, I think, causes more of an issue. Non-organic soy can cause more of an issue. And I also think that there can be an issue with a lot of like processed soy products. And so oftentimes when people are becoming vegan or vegetarian, they end up just eating a lot of processed soy, a lot of those like meat alternative and fake meats. And I really see those causing a problem for people, not only with their levels of estrogen, but also the thyroid itself. So the thyroid seems to have a sensitivity with the soy. And again, I think that has to do with the balance of iodine in the body as well, which soy can kind of compete for. So you have to be careful with those kind of things. In general, I don't recommend that men eat a lot of soy. A little bit is okay, and then certainly having soy that's a little closer to the source, whether that's edamame or having like tofu or tempeh, those are much better than having the really highly processed soy meat alternatives that also tend to have a lot of additives and things in them as well. The other really important thing for hormone regulation has to do with the liver. And so the liver is responsible for metabolizing these hormones. And so I oftentimes, when I have women who are women and men for that matter that are having some estrogen dominance, we always want to take care of the liver and the liver health too, because sometimes it's not that they're overproducing estrogens, but there's just too much estrogen in circulation because the liver isn't doing its job of excreting those estrogens out quickly enough. So there's just more in circulation. So it's really important to attend to liver health. That goes along for women who are having issues with their menstrual cycle, as well as postmenopausal women, and then certainly in men who are having an issue with that estrogen dominance. So the liver is really important in all of that. Certainly having lots of good healthy fats in the diet. I love nuts and seeds for helping with the regulation of hormones, especially with the menstrual cycle, but even the regulation of testosterone in men and helping a tremendous amount for infertility for both men and women. Good, healthy fats is super important. So nuts and seeds, getting in those omega-3s is really important for the regulation of hormones. Interesting enough, those sex hormones are actually made from cholesterol. Cholesterol is the front end of that biochemical pathway to create our hormones. So cholesterol also gets kind of a bad rap that we have. We always worry about having too high of cholesterol, but we do need to have adequate levels of that, especially of HDL, what we call the good cholesterol, and healthy amounts of cholesterol in order to make those hormones that we need to regulate those within the body. Very important. Okay, so perimenopause. Perimenopause on average lasts between 4 and 5 years. And what we will see is that there just starts to be this irregularity of the menstrual cycle. And that can go on again for 4 to 5 years. So that can be quite some time. So what we'll see oftentimes is that women will start having more frequent menstrual cycles. So they might be having 2 cycles a month, and that might go on for a while. And then all of a sudden their menstrual cycle, will be more spread out. So they'll maybe skip a menstrual cycle, several times in the same year. So maybe only having a menstrual cycle every couple of months. That's also part of that perimenopause. And then you're not officially in menopause until you've had 12 consecutive months with no bleeding at all. So not even a light period or anything else, just 12 months consecutively of no bleeding. So that's when menopause actually occurs. But in perimenopause, there oftentimes is what we'll talk about is like a reverse puberty. So a lot of the things that you go through in puberty of having hair growth on the face, of having acne, all of those things can kind of happen again as you're going through perimenopause and into menopause. And then the main symptom, and it's probably the most common symptom, as well as the symptom that women have the most difficulty with, are the hot flashes. And hot flashes can occur during the perimenopausal time period, but often are occurring within those first couple of years once menopause has officially started. So that 12 months of not having a cycle, those first couple of years after is usually when the most hot flashes are occurring. But we have reports of women even having hot flashes, 10 years into menopause, or even, several years into menopause. So the mechanism of hot flashes is actually not very well understood. We talk about this as being a vasomotor reaction, and there's several theories on why this happens. So we'll oftentimes see when a woman's going through perimenopause, we'll see a lot of irregularities in the hormones. Certainly one of the things that actually spikes is those follicle stimulating hormones and the luteinizing hormones, because they're having to do with the ovulation. It's kind of like, those numbers are really like elevating just to release those last couple of eggs, that last little bit of ovulation, to try to get the ovaries to work, as a woman's going through that perimenopausal, and then we'll see that drop off. And we see a lot of fluctuations with that dance of estrogen and progesterone for women. So certainly once menopause has officially started, we see a pretty swift drop down of those estrogen levels, but there actually can be several spikes of the estrogen during perimenopause. And so one theory about why those hot flashes occur is because there's kind of a quick drop down. So you had a quick spike and then a quick drop down of the estrogen levels that are causing the vasomotor reaction. It also may have something to do with, again, that hypothalamus gland, that there is basically a temporary reset of our body temperature regulation. And then we also know that there are some triggers of the hot flashes that occur. So certainly being in a warm or hot environment can be a trigger. Consuming hot food or drink. And when we say hot food or drink, that's temperature. That can also be spice level. And then this can also be things like coffee and alcohol that kind of have that like heat energy to them, that kind of inflammatory energy to them. So those can also be triggers for the hot flashes. And so estrogen levels dropping off very quickly, and then certainly all of those triggers, those food and environmental triggers can contribute to hot flashes too. There are many other symptoms of menopause and perimenopause that women will go through. Mental, emotional issues with memory, certainly the vaginal issues, vaginal dryness, even issues with urination, because estrogen is like a hormone that really plumps things up. So I talked already about the kind of fat stores that occur with estrogen, but estrogen also really plumps up the vaginal tissue too. So that's a big part of it too. So when there's that estrogen drop off, the skin around the labia is and in the vagina itself is also thinning out as the estrogen drops off. There can be weight gain, again, the acne, the hair loss, headaches. All of these things can be part of the menopausal symptoms. And then as far as andropause goes, so we talk about andropause as being kind of the male menopause, and so andropause is often that dropping down of testosterone levels, and because of the regulation of hormones, because they can convert to each other, we'll also oftentimes see that rise in estrogen, which is competing for the testosterone. So low levels of testosterone, higher levels of estrogen, and then oftentimes those progesterone levels are also tanking, as well as those DHEA levels are also tanking in men. And so men can have a lot of issues with fatigue, have issues with mood regulation, certainly a loss of libido. Testosterone is really important for libido for both men and women. And then one of the other things that happens oftentimes with men and lower levels of testosterone also has to do with strength and muscle mass. So testosterone is also really important for muscle mass, and so when those levels are getting low, it's hard for men to maintain muscle mass. Maybe even if they're working out, they're having trouble, putting on, actually being strong enough and to have that muscle mass to be able to have strengthen their muscles. And that goes along for women too. So actually one of the really great things for increasing testosterone naturally in men is doing weight training. And actually there's a lot of good evidence that weight training is also a really helpful and healthy thing for women, especially women over the age of 40. And this is something that can really help with weight loss. So for women who are really struggling with weight loss, doing actual weight training, lifting weights, has shown to be really in a really effective way. And it has something to do with those testosterone levels and the balance between testosterone and estrogens as well. So I am looking at my notes and I am feeling pretty well covered on our exploration of hormones today. So today's talk again was called Meet Your Hormones. We touched on some of the most important hormones that really can cause issues in the body that we are frequently talked about, but not very well understood. So I hope that this helps you to understand your hormones, understand what they do, where they come from, and maybe things that you can do to help balance your hormones a little bit more. I work with hormones all the time for both women and men, and then certainly with thyroid and adrenal issues, as well as issues with the menstrual cycle and andropause and menopause. One of the great ways, one of the things that I do as a naturopath is always finding and treating the cause. And one of the ways that I do that is by testing those hormones. And so we use saliva tests to look at the hormones. This is a much better test than just looking at the blood levels of hormones, which can fluctuate and change very frequently. When we look at it in the saliva, it's really helpful. I can check out those estrogen levels, the progesterone levels, the DHEA levels, the testosterone levels, the cortisol levels. We can also look at the adrenal function, at melatonin levels. All those levels can be looked at with saliva testing and are so helpful for knowing where the dysregulation is taking place. I do like to use bioidentical hormones. It's really important to use the bioidenticals and not the synthetics. A lot of the research and studies that have shown those hormones to cause cancer have been from synthetics and have been really misinterpreted overall. I think that with following it closely, with making sure that we're using proper forms, that using bioidenticals is very safe and very effective for helping not only for women who are having issues with their menstrual cycle, but both women and men who are struggling in menopause and andropause. It also is really helpful for helping with adrenal function, for helping with thyroid function, for helping to just have a greater sense of vitality and well-being. And so if you're interested in working with me, I'd be happy to work with you. You can check out my website, Illumination Wellness. If you are in the state of Oregon, I can see you either locally in office or through telemedicine. If you're outside of the state of Oregon, there's also ways for us to work together. I can't practice medicine outside of the state of Oregon, but I can serve as a health and wellness coach and to help you to balance your hormones. So please, if you're interested in finding out more about that, feel free to reach out to me on my website, shoot me an email or give me a call, and we can talk about how to work together. Okay, have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time.